pretty full agenda. I'm going to go ahead and go over my plan. I'm going to be talking, but I'm also going to make this interactive. So there are moments when I'm going to ask you to reflect, maybe to ask some questions in the chat, and also to do some thinking on your own. So I hope you are ready to participate actively. I'm eager to hear your thoughts. We're going to talk today a little bit about what it means to know a language, how multilinguals use different languages. We're going to compare child and adult learners because there are some important and interesting differences there. And then we'll look at what bilingualism sounds like. We'll talk about learning how to learn, and then also learning how to read and how literacy skills transfer. So Alessia gave me a nice introduction already, but I just want to tell you a little of my story. I am a person who really enjoys and loves learning languages, and I think I'm lucky to have found a career where I always get to be surrounded by different languages. I worked in a number of different bilingual schools in the San Francisco Bay Area. I also have a family. I'm a mom. That's my son, Remy, in the picture. He is turning 10 next month. So I'm going to start with just a little reflection where I'm going to ask you to think about these two questions. And, you can just think in your head, you can write down on a piece of paper, but I'd also love to hear your thoughts in the chat if you want to type an answer to these two questions. What does it mean to know a language? And what does it mean to be bilingual or trilingual or multilingual? So if you have thoughts, feel free to put them in the chat or just take a moment to reflect. This is going to kind of set us up for our topic today, to really think about what this actually means. Pausing for a moment just to give some time for reflection. Okay. And I asked this question because it is something that I really changed my thinking about as I learned more about bilingualism. And I see, thank you, in the chat, we have someone who says to speak a language, but also to read and to write, and being able to talk using this language too. Great, thank you. Great. Okay. So I'm going to share a little bit of my own story here, because I grew up in the United States and I grew up speaking English as my first language. Okay, good. I see a few more answers here, and feel free to keep adding. Great, as we move forward. So I hear it means you can speak any language fluently. And an interesting question would be, what does fluently mean? To think using those languages. That's a really interesting one too. So back to my story about French. That was the second language that I learned. I started to study it when I was in middle school, so about 12, but my mother was a French teacher, so there was a lot of French in my life. I studied it in high school. I studied it in college. I took classes in literature, and then I lived in France after I finished college and taught. So I really thought that I spoke French very well. In my mind, I thought, okay, I've got it. I'm set. I am fluent in French. But then I got a job working at a French bilingual school here in California. And I was teaching young kids English as a second language and also preschool. And I was in the preschool classroom, and a 3-year-old child, French child, was speaking to me, and he asked for something. He was a little upset, and I could not understand what he was saying to me. I had no idea what this child was saying. So I had to get some help from a French colleague. And it turns out the words he was saying were construction vehicles. He was talking about, in English, this is a backhoe. I hadn't learned that word. Also, I got a picture here of a mole because I found out when I was working with my English learning children, there were tons of animal words I didn't know either. They just hadn't come up in my life in all the various ways that I had used French. That had not come up. And then I also had the opportunity to read the French National Curriculum Guidelines because my school followed both of those, the American program and the French program. And I found that reading the curriculum was also a whole different language that was challenging for me. And I had read many books and stories in French, but I could not understand what this was saying initially. Oh, I see a really interesting comment in the chat about feeling different when speaking German, Japanese, or English. And yeah, learning about different cultures. That's a great comment. Thank you so much for that. Fascinating. So I realized that when I was thinking about learning French, I had this model in my mind that was kind of like a circle to be filled. So I thought when I started to learn French, it's just an empty circle. And then as I learn more, I'm kind of filling it up as I move on my goal toward fluency until I'm finally, okay, I'm fluent. I speak French. But my experience with the young children and the French curriculum guidelines helped me understand that that's not quite what it looks like. I read a very interesting book called Bilingual: Life and Reality. And this quote really helped me to think and understand bilingualism a little bit differently. Because what this author, his name is François Grosjean, said is bilinguals usually acquire and use their languages for different purposes in different domains of life with different people. And different aspects of life often require different languages. So what does that actually mean and look like? So if we think about my story in terms of domains or areas of language use, I can see that some areas I knew pretty well. I had spent a lot of time studying literature and poetry, so I was pretty comfortable with that language in French. I knew about food. I could get along in daily life from having lived there. But then I found out there are all these other little circles, these other domains that I had not filled up yet. And so maybe animals was, halfway full because I knew the standard animals, but the moles and the more obscure animals I didn't know. Construction vehicles and curriculum, I didn't know those either. And of course, there are lots of other things I don't know. In fact, things like economics or medicine, I haven't really used those domains in French. And even thinking about my first language, English, there are plenty of domains that I don't have the vocabulary and the language and the sentence structures for. For example, I'm not a physicist. So reading a paper about physics in English would be challenging for me. I don't have that domain in any of my languages. But the good news is that skills can be transferred. So when you learn a language, you may only learn one particular area in that language, but you can transfer it over to a different domain. So I find that once I knew how to speak about and read literature and poetry in French, it wasn't that hard to transfer the language to talking about curriculum. They're related. So I had to do some work, but it's not starting over from the beginning. We can also transfer across languages. So if I'm familiar with the vocabulary for talking about schools and curriculum in English, then it's not that difficult to transfer it over to French because some of the structures and ideas will be the same. And we're going to see that with children as well. First, I have a little activity for you. So I know a little bit of Chinese, and I'm going to give you some of the words and phrases that I know in Chinese and see if you can kind of figure out what's the domain that I have for using Chinese. So some of the phrases I know are the word for rectangle, xin qi si, equals. It's another one that I know. Are you ready? 你准备好了吗? Line up. And times. You can put this in the chat too. What would be your guess? What's my context? What's the domain of Chinese that I have? It's pretty limited. There are a lot of things that I can't do in Chinese, but there are some things that I really can talk about. So can you tell from the types of words that I know what that is? Where did I learn Chinese and how do I use it? Waiting to see if anybody wants to put something in the chat. I heard sports. Oh, that's a good guess for the lining up. Yes. Close, but not quite there. I see math. Yep. Yeah, in fact, I was a math specialist at a Mandarin speaking school. So preschool is also a good guess too, right? I was working in a Chinese immersion program as the math specialist where the math was taught in Chinese. And that was my first and primary exposure to Chinese. So I learned a lot about how to talk about math problems and also the general school language like lineup and cleanup. I can't go to a restaurant and order food. I don't have that daily life language, but I have this domain. And hopefully one day I'll be able to build on that with something else. So here's another question for you. What would you say are the domains of language use that the children use in their daily lives? They're going to be a little different from ours as adults. Maybe some of them will be the same, but if we're to think about those kind of circles that they're filling in either a first language or a second or a third language, what might some of those domains be? And you can put those in the chat too. What areas do children need to know? Oh, I see games. Yes, I agree. Definitely important in the lives of children. What else? What other areas might children? School, absolutely. Yeah. That's a big part of children's lives. So things to do with school are going to be one of the domains they have. Sports, yes. Thank you. Toys, fairy tales, family, and friends. Absolutely. Those are all great and important in the world of children. I put some on here. Some of mine are similar to what you shared. And this is just an example of some of the domains I see as someone who's worked in bilingual schools for many years, recess games and play, classroom language, all that kind of basic stuff like pens and pencils, stories and songs. That's like your fairy tales. We might introduce math, daily life, history, science, all of those things. So a way to think about this is, how do we support multilingualism in children? And I'm going to tell you a bit about how we think about these different domains at the school where I currently work, which is an Italian immersion school for children. We start at preschool and we go up to grade 8, which is about 13 years old. So what we do is, for some of these, like classroom language, daily life, stories and songs, we're going to really focus, and I'm talking about starting now in kindergarten, 5-year-olds. We're going to develop those in Italian. We're really going to focus on the additional language here, because we know they already have some of that language in English. So we're going to encourage that transfer. The kids are coming to us at 5 years old, and they've probably been in preschool. They've been in a classroom before. They've had live, they have conversations with their family about daily life, and they use a lot of stories and songs. So we already know there's a base. We're going to start using Italian right away for those. Other areas that they're going to be exposed to more throughout their journey in school, like math and history and science, they might not have that vocabulary fully developed in English yet, and not just the vocabulary, but also the language structure and things like that. So we're going to develop in both Italian and English at the same time. So we're going to do some of the classes in English, some of them in Italian, and help facilitate the transfer between those areas. And so far, recess games and play and lunch, we've realized that no matter what we do, they're just going to do that in English. We cannot make them play in Italian. So we're going to let them play in English. We're going to let them chat at lunch. But we also know that if they were in a different situation sometime in the future that invites them to play in Italian, if we sent them to Italy, they could transfer, right? Because they have these other skills, these other domains they've developed. And when the opportunity arises for that domain to be used in Italian, they will be able to do it. So there is a researcher named Jim Cummins who's done a lot of work on bilingual language and education. And I think his model is helpful in thinking about what I've just described, these sort of different domains and how we might think about them differently for children. So this cluster over on the left side that includes classroom language and daily life, stories and songs, that's what he calls BICS, which is an acronym for basic interpersonal communicative skills. So that's just kind of like the regular daily language that exists in your life. And we find that that's different from what Cummins calls cognitive academic language proficiency. So this is really, we can also call it content area, talking about math or history or science, the things that you learn about and study, and that regardless what language you're learning, you have to develop specific skills in your first or additional language. And the basic interpersonal skills usually take about 2 years to develop in a new language, whereas the cognitive academic language takes longer, about 5 years to develop in children. So I think that's helpful to think about as we look at children growing up bilingually. They're going to get these skills first, and then later we can help them build the academic language. And we can also build because they're going to be developing that in their first language too. Another important element of bilingualism is that who you're talking to really does matter. Bilinguals, whether they're adults or children, and many of you probably have experience with this, you use a specific language, not just for a context, but also for a certain person. So it might be that you have, an aunt and uncle that you use this one language with, and your friends you use this other language with. Some parents will use this to their advantage by having maybe one parent speaks one language, another parent speaks another language. But kids are very sensitive to this. What I'll see in my schools a lot is the kids who are learning Italian, but their parents are not Italian speakers. They really don't want to speak Italian to their parents. because that's just not the expectation that they have. They will speak Italian with their Italian teacher, but with their parents, they will only speak English or the home language. The good news is we can encourage them to use it through different strategies. So if I have a child, I want to talk to me in a language that isn't the usual one, I can model being a learner for them. I can let them be a teacher, or I can shift the context and maybe say, okay, we're always going to use this other language in this particular place. I have a colleague who raised her kids bilingually. She is Italian and her husband is English. And she told me that she set up a rule for her kids that in the car, they always spoke Italian. And she said that it worked so well that to this day, her kids are adults and they still just automatically switch to the car, to Italian whenever they're in the car, which I think is pretty interesting and shows you how our brains really adapt to this idea of domains and people to use languages with. So I think something I hear people talk about a lot when we're thinking about bilingualism is this idea that kids are sponges. And I'm curious if any of you have heard someone say this or read this somewhere. People saying, oh, your child will pick this language up in no time. Kids are like sponges. It's just super easy for them. So I'm curious if you've ever heard people talk about this. Yeah, I hear at least one yes in the chat. I've heard a no in the chat. Okay. I think it's an interesting model. So some of you heard it, some of you haven't. I would say I understand why people say it, but I don't agree that children are sponges. Yes, and I have some agreement in the chat too, right? That's an oversimplification of what happens, because I think there are some ways in which the language is a little easier for the children to learn, and some ways in which it's harder and easier for adults. So I kind of like to think about it more as they're climbing these parallel staircases, and it could just be two, but it could be multiple staircases, depending how many languages are in the child's life. So thinking back to our basic interpersonal language, that's kind of the starting point where our young children are learning this daily life interaction, right? And so if we're talking about academic language, if we're teaching older children or adults, it's just farther up the staircase. So it's more work. In some ways, it feels easier for a 5-year-old to learn a new language because they just don't have as much to catch up in the new language yet. So they're lower on the staircase and they can kind of transfer across the languages. So that's why our 5-year-olds can learn how to talk about daily life and sing songs in Italian much more readily than they can learn how to talk about mathematical concepts, because they already have that base in their first language. But as they grow and develop academic language in their first language or other languages, we can also transfer them to the new language. And again, having that base, something to build on, makes a huge difference. The thing that I see that's really different for adults and children is that as adults, we kind of forget that a lot goes into what we know about how to learn and how to be a student. So these are what we can refer to as metacognitive skills. How do we even think about our learning? And children haven't learned to do this. We have to teach them. So these are things like connecting to prior knowledge. When you learn something new, kind of automatically in your brain going, okay, how's this related to this other thing, right? Skills like planning how to approach any learning task, whether it's the whole task of learning how to speak a language or just one particular task I have in front of me at the moment. Monitoring and self-correcting. So noticing when something doesn't sound right, doesn't look right in writing, or reflecting on your learning and having this awareness of what's easy and what's hard. So as adults and people who've already learned things, or older children, we already have metacognitive skills in place, which is a big advantage in learning a language. So we can help our children build these skills as well, and be aware that the younger they are, they don't quite have them yet. So here's another reflection for you to put in the chat, your thoughts. I wonder if you think that a fluent speaker of a language should use only one language at any given time. So if I'm going to claim fluency in a language, do I have to only speak that language? What do you think about this? And it could be, maybe you don't have a definitive answer, but your thoughts on this. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think something else? I don't see any thoughts just yet, but you can share them at any time. I think it's an interesting question. All right, I got something popping up in the chat. Let's see. Yeah, someone says disagree. They can catch different languages at the same time. Thank you. And it may be that you agree. It depends a little on our experience learning languages. So my thinking about this has definitely changed over my times of working in bilingual schools and with children learning language. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some concepts in linguistics. And first, I want you to look at this picture of this item on the screen. In whatever languages you know, what is this thing called? What is this object called in a language that you know? And meanwhile, you think about that, I see, good, we have some other thoughts on developing the other language and using only one language for a certain period of time. Yeah, I agree. And people might mix languages if they're tired. Good point. Sometimes languages are mixed. Yes. And I wonder if that's, is that a problem for us? Is it helpful for us? So what about this thing on the screen, this item with the scissors in it? Do you have a word for this in English or in any other languages? What do you call this thing? And this is leading into a story I have from working at the French bilingual school that I worked at for 10 years. Got a pencil box. I got a German word for it. Thank you. So I would call it, for me, a pencil case. In French, it's called a trousse. But a thing I noticed that I always thought was really funny in my early years of working at the French bilingual school is the children always used the French word. They always called it a trousse. And I think in a way it's because the English word, it's two words. It feels a little, I don't know, a little long and unwieldy. The French word is just somehow felt better. So kids would use it even as they were older and quite fluent in French. They would pull that word in when they were speaking English, and they would switch it over into sort of an English sounding. They would call it a truce. Where's my truce? So this is an example of what we call borrowing. So it's using a word or phrase from one language while speaking another. And in that case, it might be adopted into the main language being used. And I imagine, because I can see from the chat, many of you are multilingual, so you may have an experience like this. Maybe there's a word or a phrase that you have in a language that you know that you just really like and that you use because we don't have the correct word or the right feeling word in another language. There's also code switching, which is kind of the alternating use of two or more languages. And both of those things are really normal parts of bilingualism, both as they progress and grow, and as people become fluent bilinguals. Good. Oh, it's fine to be on the previous question about languages can be mixed when kids are small, but children will master both languages later and start differentiating them. Thank you. Yes, that's a little bit where we're going with this. Another story from my current school. The kids eat lunch here, and when I'm supervising lunch, they will come up, they're supposed to sit until they're finished, and then they ask if they can clean up. But for whatever reason, the Italian word for clean up, sparacchiare, has really stuck in their brains, and they always want to use that. And what I see is the younger kids, they'll mix it. They'll say to me, posso sparacchiare? Which is funny because posso sparacchiare means can I clean up? So when they use it in this way, they're saying, can I clean up? But what they're really doing is they're playing with the language and they're developing as bilinguals. They maybe aren't fluent yet. These are kindergarten first graders, so they're 5, 6, 7 years old. They aren't fluent in Italian yet, but it's an important part of their lives. They want to use it and they want to try to express themselves using the Italian words that they know. So in younger kids and earlier bilinguals, I see a lot of this kind of pulling in phrases and mixing so that they can start to build an identity as a person who speaks that language. And so they can also be able to express themselves using their first language as kind of a prop to help them get there. But as they get older and more fluent, I see a real shift. And so some other examples that I've seen from my Chinese school, I remember hearing kids about the same age saying, 老师,我是 thinking in 我的 head. So she was saying, teacher, I'm thinking in my head. But she was pulling in the bits of Chinese that she knew, and where she didn't know the Chinese, she was filling in with English. But then this is an example that I heard from the teachers I work with who are Italian, but who speak English as well. So they'll pull maybe a certain phrase for some reason into their Italian. So we were speaking about program and curriculum, and one of the teachers said in Italian, una domanda che abbiamo è come possiamo con i grandi classi fare I small groups. So she's an Italian person, but for whatever reason, she liked that phrase in English. So what she's saying is a question that we have now is how can we, with our big classes, make small groups? And I see that with children too, as they get more fluent, as someone just very rightly said in the chat, they start to differentiate and spread out the languages and be able to use them. So I wanted to share this because I think we don't need to worry when kids are mixing languages. I think some people tend to be concerned and think we have to keep them separate, but it's a normal part of the learning process. And we can help them to develop opportunities to use the language, but we need to remember that they're building on what they know. And this is referred to as translanguaging. It's an approach to teaching in multilingual contexts that invites learners to use all of their linguistic and cognitive resources. So remembering that we know skills transfer across languages, we don't want to take away from kids what they already know. And what I see in bilingual schools is, young kids coming in, they've just learned how to communicate in a language. So it's a big switch to them to be suddenly told, okay, now you have to communicate in this other language. And we don't want to take away all that they've learned. We want to encourage them to build on it and help them in building on it. So I'm switching topics now, and this is a little interactive activity to illustrate the next principle that I'm going to talk to you about. So what you're going to see is I am going to put some words on the screen here, and I am going to ask you to say the color that the word is written in. And I've put these in Belarusian, so I will not be able to read them yet. But I'm going to ask you, you can say it out loud to yourself. You can try typing it in the chat, but your task is say the color, not the word. I hope that makes sense to you. So you're going to say the color of the text. Are we ready? Here we go. And I would recommend just saying these out loud so that you can see what it feels like. Okay, some of you are translating, which is an extra skill that you have to develop here. So you're saying the names of the color. Okay, how was that? Was that easy? Was that hard? How was that for you? You can just throw it up in the chat. What did that feel like? I see colors still popping up. It was easy. Makes sense? Okay, we're going to do this a little differently on the next slide. The task is the same. You need to say the name of the color that the text is written in, and I want you to try to do it as fast as you can. Okay, here's round two. It's going to be a little bit different. It's getting harder when presented fast. Difficult. I read the text. Okay, well, here's my next challenge. We'll see how this one feels for you. Remember, you need to tell me the name of the color that it's written in, not the word. We're not translating. And see how quickly you can get that out. What color is the text here? And I'm going a little bit fast. What color is the text? Someone knew the trick. Okay. Okay, how was that? How was this round for you? Was it hard? Was it easy? Was it so-so? And what made it different from the other round? It was harder, I see, and it was slower. Why? Still the same. First read and then look at the color. Interesting. Yeah. What made this one harder for some of you? And for some of you, it's about the same. Our brains are interesting, aren't they? So what I wanted to illustrate to you here is a principle that I always think about when I'm thinking about children learning in a language context. And I think in this case, there's some interference going on in your brain, right? Even for those of you who are saying you first read and then look at the color, you have words and you also have colors. So your brain is trying to process a couple of different things. And I think some of you found that when the word matches the color, it's a little bit easier. When your brain sees that the word is different from the color of the text, it is harder. So I wanted to share this with you because it's an example of what we call cognitive load. So I could talk a lot about this theory, but I have limited time today. So I'm just going to share a little bit about it. There's more information in the handout that will be shared with you. But cognitive load is kind of the work that our brains are doing and that our children's brains are doing when they're learning a task. And there are 3 different types of cognitive load. One of them is intrinsic. And this is just this is like the built-in challenge of a task. It's always going to be there. We can't eliminate it. We can manage it. So thinking about learning a language, there's an intrinsic challenge in learning how to speak or use another language, or even if you've learned the language already, but it's not your most comfortable language, there's some intrinsic load in, reading or speaking or writing in that language. Another type is called germane cognitive load. That comes from kind of this effort that we need to process new information and to connect it with our prior knowledge and put it into our long-term memory. We like germane cognitive load because even though it is difficult, it's meaningful and it helps us to make those memories. And then we have extraneous cognitive load. And that's what I was showing you with the previous example. Extraneous cognitive load comes from maybe the way in which the information is presented. It doesn't support learning, and it should be reduced. So I was giving you a little extraneous cognitive load by making the colors of the text be different from the actual word itself. And I think about this a lot, again, with children, because with kids, we really have to be mindful of what kind of load we're putting on their brains. So some ways that you can avoid this extraneous cognitive load, I would say, are to focus on specific skills at one particular time. You can't do everything all at once. So we're not going to, at the same time, practice handwriting and also learn vocabulary. Or maybe we're not going to learn how to speak about a particular topic while also engaging in something social that is difficult for the kids. We have to think about what learners already know and encourage them to make connections. And also always be aware of the social and emotional contexts of learning, because that's always present with all humans, but I think particularly with kids, if they're in a classroom, if they're sitting next to their friend or they're distracted by something that happened at recess, that's going to have a big impact on them and is going to add to the cognitive load. So when we're thinking about kids at home or at school, think about what you're asking them to do and how we can focus their attention on what we want them to really learn in that moment. And regardless of how you address cognitive load and manage it, it's always present and it is hard. It is tiring. I notice that our kindergartners, when they start school here, their parents are often really surprised by how exhausted they are at the end of the day, especially compared with being in different contexts. And it really is just the load that's on them by constantly listening to another language or trying to express themselves in another language, as they get older, trying to read and write. It's a lot. And I'm sure that all of you here have experience with this as well and know what it's like when you're straining to express yourself or listen to another language. So I think it's important to be mindful of that with kids too. They're going to be tired, and we got to give them breaks sometimes. And we have to understand that's the reality of the learning experience. I'm going to talk a bit now about literacy and learning how to read, because the good news is that you really only learn to read once. And I've worked in 3 different bilingual schools with very different languages. I've been in French, Chinese, and Italian. And I see the same thing regardless. Children transfer literacy skills across languages and alphabets, but adults and parents really do need to support this transfer. They don't do it automatically. We have to help them see how to transfer it. And it is there even if we have a language like Chinese, which has a completely different writing system than we see in English. So here's a little kind of activity for you to take a look at in a way that I might help to facilitate transfer of skills with children. We might take a look at some words here in English and Italiano. The English word is city. The Italian word is città. And we would ask this question. This is kind of a metacognitive question, encouraging the development of those skills. What is the same and what's different about these two words? And I encourage you to participate and answer my question here. What do you notice when we study the Italian word and the English word for city? And we're looking both for similarities and for differences. That's part of the process and the learning and thinking. What do you notice when you look at these words? What's the same? What's different? I guess you can keep thinking about that question because I'm going to add some more words to the list here and we're going to compare them. Okay, thank you. I see letters are pretty much the same, but the sounds are different in English. What about if we throw Belarusian and Russian in here? Okay, I see same writing and the pronunciation is different in the English and Italian. Okay. Can we see any similarities now that I've introduced a different writing system, different languages, different alphabets? In the Italian and the English, we readily saw some similarities. Are there similarities that we can see when we look at the Russian and the Belarusian? And maybe not just between each other, but between the English and the Italian. It may feel like they're very different, but I wonder if there's something that is the same. We can also notice what's different too. That's the question, isn't it? You can keep thinking about that and feel free to put something in the chat if you have an answer for this, but I'm going to go on to my next slide. Because I think it is important that I share with you that reading skills really do transfer across different writing systems. Even when we're looking at alphabets that feel and seem very different, there are certain skills that are there and certain similarities. Okay, we write what we hear in Belarusian. So I think maybe what you're saying, Tatiana, is that it's there's a correspondence to the sound and when you're writing what you hear, which is the same more or less in Italian, a little more in Italian than in English, because English has some strange spelling patterns in it. So the way that I think about this is there are universal literacy skills. And I wonder if you read, there's a picture here of a father reading to a baby. And I wonder if you, with your children, if you read to them when they were babies before they could speak or necessarily really understand language. And if you did that, why did you read to your baby or to your young toddler? What are they learning? What are they getting out of that moment? So there are a lot of universal literacy skills that we start to build before kids are literate. And we can also think about these as pre-literacy skills. Print awareness is one of them. And this is just understanding that there's this thing called print and it carries meaning and that we can notice it out in the world. Young kids are going to start to notice signs and see, oh, that those symbols, they mean something and they're important. Also print motivation, just being interested in and enjoying books and reading. That is a literacy skill, and that does transfer readily to any language and any reading process. Alphabetic awareness. So I was kind of touching on this a little bit earlier, understanding that marks on the page represent sounds that combine to make words that combine to make sentences. So even regardless of what the alphabet is, what the writing system is, what the language system is, all of these things are true. And these are skills that children already have if they've learned anything about books or reading in their primary language or their first language, and they can transfer those to another language. So what I know, and unfortunately, I don't speak Belarusian, but I do know that there is a direct correspondence between a sound and a symbol. And that's the same that we have in English. And it takes time for kids to learn that. It's the same that we have in various languages, right? So knowing, oh, that's a symbol and it means this, we don't have to learn that again and we can transfer it. Okay, so I see, yeah, I see. Thank you for that, Marhartia. I don't have kids, but when I was a child, my mom read to me every day. Yeah. So the stuff is getting in there even when you don't know it, if you start reading yourself and joining syllables. So those skills that you had learned at that moment are transferable to any writing system in the world, even if it is dramatically different. The Mandarin writing system I found really interesting to learn when I was at the Chinese school because it doesn't have that sound to symbol correspondence. It doesn't work that way. There's not an alphabet. It's more symbols that carry meaning. But even so, the skill is transferred for the kids and they learned how to read in both languages. Some other universal literacy skills are, as I mentioned earlier, the metacognitive skills and some of the ones that are specific to literacy. And here we're talking about maybe further developed literacy. So skills like skimming or summarizing or predicting what's going to happen next in a text, or skills like using a dictionary to look things up. Once kids have developed that, when they're 6 or 7 or 8 years old, they start really learning how to read and they read to learn about things. They know how to approach a book, and that is going to transfer to any alphabet, any language that they learn. Content knowledge is also something that transfers. So this is kind of going back to the idea I addressed earlier of domains of language use. Knowledge of specific areas really helps in comprehending texts. There's a lot of research showing that children are better at comprehending texts. This shouldn't be a surprise. I'm sure it's not, but they're better at understanding a text if it's about something that they know about. So if we ask a child to read about baseball, but they don't know anything about baseball, it's going to be much harder for them than to read about, cats, if that's something that they really love. So the content knowledge is going to transfer as well when they're learning how to read in additional languages. There are reading skills that are specific to a writing system. So some examples of these are print directionality. So which direction words and sentences are read. That's different, in English as well as in Italian, and in French, we read from left to right. But in some other languages, you might read from right to left, or you might read up and down. So that's something that is different, but we can help the kids notice, okay, in this case, it's different. This is a different system, and they'll be able to learn and understand that. The grammar and orthography is going to be different, as I'm sure you are all aware in different languages, the order of the words, the sentence structure. That's something we need to really encourage them to notice, which is why we often, directly study the grammar systems when we learn new languages. But I think also knowing that there is a grammar is something that transfers. That's something that transfers from one language to another, just understanding the concept that, oh, there's a way that the sentences are put together. And I see that as part of the process of when kids get older and they're learning another language, if they've already studied one, or if they studied grammar in their first language, it's a lot easier for them to kind of think about sentences and sentence structure in a new language. Culture, of course, is a reading skill that's specific to a writing system. So the values and the themes that are expressed in literature are really going to vary by culture. I remember we had a comment earlier about this sort of sense of a different identity when using another language, and I think that's part of this as well. So in the schools I've worked at, one challenge has often been, as the children get older and they start reading, helping them connect to the books in the other language and get used to this sort of different culture feel experience. French books for young adults are very different than American books for young adults. So we really had to think about how to help them understand the culture and the values and experience that they're reading are different from the ones that they experience in their sort of regular daily English speaking life. Story structure and rhetoric, also different across writing systems. So writing conventions and style also vary across cultures. That's important too, to think about if children are going to be learning how to write an essay in different languages. The expectations that we have may not be the same. And I definitely see this with our upper elementary school children, 10-year-olds, as they move into middle school, 11, 12, and they're learning how to write. It's kind of amazing because they can learn two different approaches to writing an essay. But we do have to make them aware of these things. We have to really explicitly show them, these are the things that are different. Here's how you can pay attention to them. So building the metacognitive skills for them to think and talk about these things. I'm very happy that we have time to do this little activity. This is my final activity for the day. And this is a way, sort of an example of an activity I would do with children to activate metacognitive skills. So we have these questions that we often use. I showed you earlier this, what's the same, what's different, as a way to compare and to activate prior knowledge and connect. Another one of those is, what do you think? What do you notice? And what do you wonder? So very often when teaching languages, or actually anything to children, I find that it helps a lot not to just tell them something, but to encourage them to think about it before they even necessarily know what we're doing. So I'm going to do this to you, and I'm going to ask for your participation. Take a look at this, and please put in the chat what you're noticing, what you're wondering. So you might be having questions, you might be having observations. I would love to hear what you think, what you notice, what you wonder when you take a look at this. Take your time. If you have a piece of paper, you could jot some things down. But what do you notice and what do you wonder when you look at this? Okay, we have, okay, a few people are saying that it's numbers, numerals, guessing it's, ooh, okay. Okay, I see another, that it's not that different. They use another writing system, asking if they're numbers. I hear it's 1 to 10 on the first 9 and then 11 to 99. Interesting. First row has 1 symbol. The second row has 2 symbols. I see that. The following rows have 3. Very interesting. There are some empty squares. Maybe inability to combine the symbols. Great. So you notice a lot of things. You notice a lot of patterns. Yes. So I will tell you, these are numbers. You are correct. And I'm interested, something I would ask children too, but how did you know they were numbers? And it's interesting that you saw the number of symbols kind of growing as we moved down the chart. How did you know that they were numbers? And my task for you, while you think about that, is there are missing spots, which you can see. Can you fill them in? The empty spaces, yes. The empty spaces are my challenge to you. I want you on a piece of paper that you have to try to write down what symbol you think might go in there. And if you feel like it, you could also try to figure out what number it is. Since you've correctly guessed that these are numbers, these are the numbers in Chinese. Can you figure out what goes in the empty spaces? Can you try to write it using the Chinese symbols? And also, can you figure out what the actual number is? Okay. And it might be hard to try to write them in the chat. I don't know if you have Mandarin on your keyboard. Okay, good. Oh, all right. Elena has one for the first gap, would be 21. Interesting. Anyone else have other gaps that you filled in, and how did you figure that out? 21 is the first gap. Okay, I think if I click, let me see what order I put the reveals. I'm going to reveal the missing numbers to you. Yeah, I'm sure you can't write it. I'll show you some of the missing letters. Huh? Is that what you expected? Looks like it matches exactly what Elena said. I'm going to fill in some of the other gaps. As I click, you'll see some more. You can see if it kind of matches with your expectation and understanding of how the system worked. There's another one down there. Maybe you know what number that is that I just revealed. What else do we have? Another gap over there. Okay. So I wanted to do that activity with you because I wanted to give you an example of how you could transfer your literacy skills, even I assume not being Chinese speakers, though maybe I shouldn't assume that. Maybe someone here does speak Chinese, but if you don't speak Chinese, how were you able to figure this out in this completely different writing system? So what metacognitive skills did you use? What did you notice? What did you look at? Because you did a pretty good job. You had this sorted. So how did you do it? And I guess you can put some stuff in the chat, but I will share. Oh, they're the same with Japanese numbers. So you had an advantage there. Logic, yeah. Intuition, interesting. Yeah. Um, I think, a lot of it was the metacognitive skills that you have and the skills that you have about understanding how symbols are put together, maybe understanding how number systems work. The first three are obvious, then 10 in a row. Okay. Yeah. So there's a kind of a pattern here. And I think that you used what you already know about numbers and about reading to figure out a new system. So just wanted you to see how that works and how it would work with children. You have so many skills that are already there, so much knowledge that's already there. And so do the kids that you might be teaching or working with, your own children. Even very young children have learned a huge volume of things that we can build on in terms of language, in terms of literacy, in terms of being able to speak and communicate. I had one more story that I wanted to tell you because I think another piece is that every child really is different. And of course, I imagine you all already know this, but I've talked a lot about different things that we're going to see as kids acquire second or additional languages. But I just will never forget these two children that I came across when I was teaching English at the French bilingual school. I knew there were two new kids and they were in kindergarten. So they were 5 years old. They had just come from France. They didn't speak any English. And I went into their classroom because I would usually either work with the kids learning English in the class or I might pull them out of the classroom. And I get in there, there are two kids, and one of them is just sitting there in the back of the room, sucking his thumb. And the other one, he's just like right in the middle of everything. He has no idea what's going on. He doesn't know any English, but he does not care. Like he's, talking, dancing, answering questions. And I never forgot those two. They really stuck with me because there's kind of a spectrum in how children respond to this, this experience of not being able to understand what's going on or being given a new language when they have just acquired their first one. And some of them, it's overwhelming and it's challenging. Like the first one sucking his thumb. What he needed in that moment was to know what was going on. He was a smart kid. He was used to understanding. So I went over and I talked to him and I said, do you want me to translate the story for you? Because they were reading a story. Or do you want to just try to listen and understand? And he said, I want to know what's going on. So I translated it for that first experience into French, just so he could feel connected and he could know that he could communicate with me. I didn't want to speak only English with him. I wanted to help him know that we could talk and to feel like he was part of that experience. For the other child who was dancing around and having a great time, I needed to make sure that he did start to notice the language and pay attention to and build the metacognitive skills that he had. For him, English was this fun and exciting puzzle. So he had different needs. So of course, there are some things that we can say sort of universally for people learning language. And I've talked a lot about some of those important concepts about how we transfer skills, about thinking about different domains of language use and building metacognitive skills, and also about the importance of cognitive load. But I do think every individual is different. And if you are a parent, you know your child better than anyone else. If you're working with kids or students, you know them very well too. So that's all that I have for you on this morning in California, evening where you are, I believe. Thank you so much for joining me. I really enjoyed this, and thanks for your active participation in the chat. I hope you'll join us for our next webinar, which is a scaffolded dialogue about parenting, teaching, and supporting multilingualism with all three specialists. And that's going to be on Saturday, April 6th. And I hope that I will see you there. If you have questions now, we do have a few minutes that you can put a question in the chat, or you can unmute. And actually, I think you can just put questions in the chat. I'm happy to answer questions for the next 3 minutes. Otherwise, we'll see you hopefully on April 6th. Anyone have any questions? All right, thank you. Thanks so much, everyone. Okay, I see a question here. Are there any systems to grow bilingual, multilingual children? For example, talking with them one day in English and one day in German. Is there something like this? That's a great question. I think there are several systems, and I guess my answer would be there's not only one right system. I've heard of people doing this in very different ways, and I think it really depends a lot on your particular context. So I think this idea of one day in English, one day in German, that could work. You could also have something like different contexts for English and for German. So saying when we're at the house, we're going to speak English, and when we go out and we're on a walk or in the city, we're going to speak in German. So that's another way that you could do it. I think the important thing is considering that making sure you're giving room for the kids to connect and build on the languages on each other, and then making sure also that you are building towards moments when you're really using only one of those languages. It could be, as I said, it could be place specific, it could be person specific. With this person, we're always going to speak English. With this person, we're always going to speak German. And I see another question about strategies that can be used to support and develop the native language in a multilingual family, especially if parents do not speak the language. That's another really good question. So as I've said, the native language is really, that is super important. It's the base that the children are building on. So I think if you have a multilingual family, I've seen different strategies. Sometimes it might be one parent who speaks that language and the other parent speaks another language. That can be challenging because you are sometimes then leaving someone out of the conversation. So you might do it that way, but you might, I think, shift it to make it more be about context and location and say, when we speak this, when we're in this place, we're going to use this language. Or you could have moments or times of the day when you use that one language and then use the other one. And we can talk more about that hopefully on the panel on April 6th. I see a question about what competence should plurilingual teachers possess? Good question too. I think plurilingual teachers, so if you're teaching in a context where you want to really take advantage of translanguaging, that person certainly should be multilingual themselves and should have an awareness of how that language is going to develop. I think the most important thing is knowing how to make connections between the languages and knowing how to facilitate transfer between the languages, because it's not just going to happen automatically. All right, I have one more question. What are the most effective ways to assess language progress in multilingual children, considering their interaction with multiple languages? That's a great question, one that I think about very often. Working in a school as we're trying to do assessment and evaluation of children. I don't know that I'll be able to give you a complete answer in this 1 minute, but I will say it is important to know that in multilingual children, language skills typically take longer to develop. So our expectations are different for literacy acquisition at my current school in English than they are for monolingual schools. And what we see is we expect children to be 1 to 2 grade levels behind in their literacy skills up until about grade 4 or grade 5 when they're 10 or 11. And then we really see them catch up and then surpass their monolingual peers. And I think we see the same thing for oral language development. It will take longer because they're building more language. So I think the number one principle for assessment is that we need to set different expectations and know that they will be acquiring at a different rate, but they'll catch up. So I guess that's all of our time. Literature and films. I think I have a handout that's going to be shared, and I will think about that question too, if there are any literature and films that I could specifically recommend on this. There's some great books to read, so I will have to share that with you in a handout. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me today. It was a real pleasure to talk to you, and I really appreciate your being here and your participation and your wonderful questions. And I hope that I'll